Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to return to the subject of Terramaster, but unlike a lot of my videos when I've talked about their network attached storage solutions, today I want to talk about their DAS solutions, direct attached storage. A lot of users who know about Terramaster in the world of NAS, many of them aren't even aware that the brand actually has a fairly extensive range of direct attached storage solutions. These cover USB in a myriad of different forms and Thunderbolt, but recently, and I say recently, in the last few months of 2025, the brand has now started playing around with USB4 connected DAS boxes, both as expansions to their NAS devices and as standalone storage solutions. Now, for many of you, it's not going to come as a surprise. Two of the arguably best DAS boxes that I talked about in 2024 were the Hybrid D series, like this one. This one's a 4-bay hard drive solution with 4 M.2 NVMe's there. However, it did arrive with just USB 10 gig connectivity. For rack mount users, they've got things like this mini 4-bay 10 gig USB rack expansion there that can also be used as standalone. But this video is ever so slightly different, because now when they're looking at USB 4, when you talk about USB 4 and bandwidth, you're of course talking about M.2 NVMe's. And this is the D1 SSD. This huge heat sink here is for a USB 4 external drive. Now this knocks around for about $100 to $109, and I think we should get the elephant in the room out of the way. Who cares? Because realistically, external chassis, even for USB 4 right now, are ubiquitous in the extreme, and you can pick them up for a not dissimilar price point to this from well-known brands globally there. What exactly is this bringing to the party that doesn't already exist? I will say there are a few things. Alongside this, we will have a video coming soon on this. This is the D4, the review's live. I'm sure YouTube's recommending it on the side. And this is a 4-bay USB 4 device there. So for those that are looking at greater performance there, that is going to be an option for you. But this isn't just about performance. This is about sustained performance. Many USB 4 drives that you see online, not all of them of course, but some of them do suffer with two main problems. Number one, there's a lot of older generation Thunderbolt 3 external casing that have just been remarketed as USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 thanks to backwards compatibility. However, the flexibility of lane allocation, and that is ultimately how many paths can be laid down to the connected device, on Thunderbolt 3 is a lot strict. It's 3x4 speed there for M.2 connected devices with the Thunderbolt 3 connection for that 40 gigabits per second. However, in the case of USB 4, it's a great deal more flexible, 4x1, 4x2. You also have a better arrangement and separation. You can have multiple 4.1s, a 4.2 and a 4.1, a 4.1, a 4.1, and all of these allow for more flexible deployment. Now, 40 gigabits per second or 4,000 megabytes per second or 4 gigabytes per second, don't screw me in the comments over the missing bits and bobs there, that only needs a Gen 4 x 2 lane to reach that performance number, because each lane of Gen 4 is 2,000 megabytes per second there. So using USB 4 in that scenario allows for drives to run at a lower speed, which can often drop down the temperature rather than times 4 times M.2s that will often require heat sinks. Nevertheless, sustained performance will always generate a lot of heat, which brings us back to the design of this. Now, the design of this is where this is that second point, the cheap USB 4 connected external drives fall down. When you have USB 4 connected with a drive inside, that performance over time just gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then it throttles the drive. Thanks to this being silent, yet an entire fanned heatsink all the way around, vented I should say, not fanned, the result is that the temperatures when this was in operation, we'll talk about in a bit, were absolutely fantastic. And it was even after 5 minutes of repeat repeated 1 GB file testing of a USB4, constantly hitting 2.5 to 3,000 megabytes per second. Indeed, the brand themselves do rate this at both read and write at over 3 gigabytes per second, and that was reflected in my testing. So for example, when I was running an AJA repeated 1 GB file test there, I saw read performance of around 3,000 to 3,100 megabytes per second and write performance at 2,500 to around 2,600 megabytes per second there. And that was sustained as well on repeated tests. When we went for Crystal Disk, and that was a 1 GB test, we saw read performance there at 3,089 megabytes per second, write performance at 2,600 megabytes per second, and mixed 70/30 read-write access at 2,500 megabytes per second. Lovely stuff. Next up, we saw Atto, and with Atto, a 1 GB test there, we saw read peak at around 3.55 gigabytes per second and write peak at around 2.8 gigabytes per second. Now, all of those are synthetic tests. What about Windows? Well, I transferred 100 gigabytes of mixed photo, video, document, PDF, you name it, data over to the drive. It took 63 seconds to transfer 100 gigabytes of data, and that averaged out at 1.58 gigabytes per second. Now, circling back to that point about temperatures, as you can see here on screen, I had the drive connected and I was running a repeated 1 GB AJA file test for a little over 5 minutes. In that 5-minute period, the SSD onboard controller for the drive I was using there, an Acer Gen 4 drive, did reach a peak of 44 to 45 degrees. It never went higher than that. And that was with Crystal Disk refreshing every minute. Now, when it came to the enclosure itself, from you can see from the thermal camera, again, that only achieved 41 to 42 degrees. That is why this external case is a big deal. They are coming late to the party here, but they are bringing arguably a very, very well put and sustained performance and temperature built external case here. Now, they're not producing the drive with a designated storage drive. A lot of Thunderbolt 4 and USB 4 drives that are built to this standard generally involve having SSDs where the thermal pasting and the heatsink pads are pre-placed. That's why you generally find that if you look at companies like Sonic, for example, and a few others, when they release external enclosures for M.2 NVMe at USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 like this, they pre-install the storage. This doesn't have that. You pick your own drives up to 2280. Now, keep in mind, if you don't use a Gen 4 SSD inside this, those performance numbers will effectively halve, because inside this is on a Gen 4 x 2 lane. And if you're using a Gen 4 x 4 SSD, it means you're going to saturate both of those lanes at the ×2. However, if you install a Gen 3 SSD, that will be limited down to ×2 for that lane. The Gen 3 lane gives you 1,000 megabytes per second as opposed to 2,000 megabytes per second of Gen 4. Ultimately, that means that it will effectively halve the performance if you use a Gen 3 SSD, that although it may promise hitting 3,000 megs, it won't achieve it in this case, so keep that in mind. But what I find the most intriguing is that unlike a lot of external cases that I talked about before, and I will talk about this in the D4 video as well, there is a lot of technical information about the build on the official pages for this that you simply don't find elsewhere. They not only name the controller, again ASM2464 PDX, a fairly well used USB 4 to M.2 NVMe Gen 4 controller for storage drives. They published that on the page, and they're not alone in doing that, but they're one of the few brands that I've seen on their external enclosures that actually name the lane allocation there. They're prepared to sign it by the line. Most M.2 enclosures you see rarely ever talk about the speed allocated to the M.2 connection inside. And as we just talked about, it's really important, because you could have the fastest drive in the market, but if it's not the right gen, you're not going to get those speeds per lane. That's why I really like this. Now, things that I don't like about it. One, this cable, This is the cable it arrives with. Now, I get it, it's nice that they've included a cable there, and it's not a bad cable. It's a 40 gigabits per second, rated 240 watt power delivery there. That's lovely stuff, and indeed this doesn't even need external power. But my God, this cable is short. And I get it, it's a portable drive, it shouldn't have to be long, but I would have gone at least a meter. Again, for $109, I would have expected a longer cable. It's a good cable, but at that length, it's a bit annoying. It even made some of the filming of the thermals a little tricky. Also, I know I've deep dove into the lane allocation there and the controller, but most users aren't going to do that. And I think the brand could stand to be a lot louder than they are about the drives you should use inside this. They do highlight a lot of Gen 4 drives. They highlight on there that you have to use a Gen 4 drive to achieve those speeds. They mention on there several times in their testing they used a Gen 4 SSD. That's fine, but they should have better recommendations for drives that users can use inside this, because the kind of, creator, post-production, photo, video editor, call them what you will, that are probably going to use a drive like this, they're going to need to have a clear understanding about the best drives to use. Because even if you look at Gen 4 drives, look at Samsung, great example. Samsung have got a couple of Gen 4/Gen 5 drives in the market right now. They've got very misleading performance numbers based on whether they're set to Gen 4x4 or 5x2 speed. And these don't have DRAM on them either. These require you to use host memory buffer, so therefore you're going to have to use your host system for a lot of that on SSD caching that would normally be on the drive. Terramaster needs to be clearer about the drives they recommend for use inside this to achieve those speeds. But apart from that, I really like this as a package, and to be brave enough to bring your first M.2 USB4 external enclosure into the market halfway through 2025, it takes guts right now for people to just go, who cares? But this does stand up, and I am going to introduce this into my production flow. Chances are, if you see me at a trade show, this will probably be knocking around in my bag. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Should be a written review below as well. Alongside that, there are links to get hold of this at a few different retailers. So if you found the video helpful, and if you want to support what we do, please use those links if you want to go to those stores. It results in a small commission allowing us to keep doing what we do. I'll also recommend a few different SSDs that I know will achieve high speeds inside this link below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.